If that's all right, Professor, you can have a seat, and I'll go through my preamble, and then you can all get ready. So, I declare open this public hearing of the Foreign Affairs and Aid Subcommittee of the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade for the inquiry into Australia's response to the priorities in the Pacific Island countries and the Pacific region. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we meet today on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I also acknowledge the cultures of any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are present with us today or who are watching this public hearing. This hearing will be broadcast on the Parliament's website, and the proof and official transcripts of the proceedings will be published on the committee's webpage. I now welcome a range of witnesses who have joined us here this morning, and we'll begin by asking you all for the Hansard record. Would you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee? And I'll start with my left.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Karen Baker. I'm a fellow with the Department of Pacific Affairs at the Australian National University.
Welcome, Doctor.
Hello, Professor Michael Leach. I'm from Swinburne University of Technology in Melbourne.
Hello, Associate Professor Julian Barbara. I'm the Director of the Coral Bell School of Asia and Pacific at the ANU.
Yuan Talofa. My name is Salah Dr. George Carter. I'm the Deputy Head for the Department of Pacific Affairs, but also the Director for the Pacific Institute at the Australian National University.
Marian, greetings. My name is Aka Rimun. I come from Kiribati and I'm a PhD scholar at the School of Regulation and Governance at the ANU.
Talofa, my name is Dr. Eliora Malifa. I'm Senior Project Manager of the Pacific Research Program, or Project Phase 2, at the Australian National University.
Welcome all. This hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I now invite each of you to make an opening statement before we proceed to a discussion, and why don't we go in the same order in which we did the introductions?
Sure. Because Professor Leach and Associate Professor Barbara and I are talking about the same research project, maybe I'll just start with a few interesting findings and how they might relate to the inquiry. Then Professor Leach can talk more through the findings, and then Associate Professor Barbara can finish with some reflections on the broader significance. Our Pacific Attitude Survey has been conducted in Samoa and Vanuatu in collaboration with local research partner institutions to seek out data on attitudes towards key political and social issues. And I'll talk about a few, including gender, labour mobility and climate change here. So our survey found a majority of respondents were supportive of measures to increase women's political leadership, including substantial levels of support for temporary special measures or quotas to increase women's representation in Parliament, and that closely aligns with the Australian government's gender focus in the region. But the survey also showed that social norms that prioritise men's leadership are very strong, and in both Samoa and Vanuatu there was more resistance to women's participation in customary politics compared to Parliament and other non-traditional spaces and positions. In both Samoa and Vanuatu, in terms of labour mobility, the majority of respondents reported that they were willing to temporarily work in another country. And then we had an expanded set of labour mobility questions in Vanuatu, which revealed really strongly positive views of schemes like the Seasonal Workers Program, with improved household income cited as the primary benefit. We asked a lot of questions around climate change in the survey. And one interesting finding was that while a large majority of Ni Vanuatu respondents, 81%, believed that climate change is an urgent problem that must be addressed, in Samoa this was a lot more split, with 39% of respondents believing that it will never be necessary to address climate change. And to us, these results suggest that there is a disconnect between the broad elite consensus on climate change and general public perspectives that these popular attitude surveys really help illuminate in the region. So overall, the findings of the Pacific Attitude Surveys in Samoa and Vanuatu suggest that Australian development priorities in the region are for the most part aligned with Pacific priorities. But results like the attitudes towards climate change emphasise the value of popular attitude surveys and truly understanding the perspectives of Pacific peoples as distinct from Pacific governments. Popular attitude survey data collection in the Pacific isn't easy and it needs dedicated funding to continue, but the insights they generate are really important for our understanding of Pacific priorities. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Yes, just to continue, we asked Pacific citizens in Samoa and Vanuatu what their development priorities were, and they were identified as general economic management, number 1, health, number 2, followed by infrastructure and government services, and in Vanuatu, quite a high response for climate change, as well as you might predict. A graph that you can't see in the submission is we also asked which country they believed had the most influence in the Pacific region as a whole. And in Samoa, 58% identified China. And in Vanuatu, 42% identified China as well. In Vanuatu, Australia was second with 35%. And we found a significant association between those respondents who received remittance income and seeing Australia as influential in the Pacific. So there's a direct connection between those policies and those outcomes in terms of perceived influence. We then, and now I can refer you to the submission figure 8 and 9, we asked specifically about influence on their own country in Samoa and Vanuatu. And you can see those graphs at 8 and 9. In Vanuatu, Australia and China were perceived to have the strongest influence on Vanuatu, ahead of New Zealand, France and the United States, with the UK bringing up the rear there. And in Samoa, China was significantly ahead of other countries for perceived influence, with Australia third behind New Zealand, of course, which has an important historical relationship with Samoa. We also asked which country should be a model for their own country's development. And I refer you there to figure 12 in the submission. And in Vanuatu, Australia received the largest number of respondents there as a model for their own development with 47%. In Samoa, it was split between New Zealand on 36% and China on 33% as a model for their own development. Interestingly, the United States does not feature very highly in those until we reach the point of asking about security agreements. We asked a question in security agreements, and I refer you to figure 13 here. Which country should be prioritised for security agreements? And this is the Vanuatu result. The United States emerged as the largest there with 58%, with Australia second on 26%, and the others are behind there. Finally, for my evidence, we asked the motivations for giving aid, their perceptions of why donor countries would give aid. And in economic development, it was the largest response in Vanuatu with 45, very similar in Samoa with 43. Gaining influence over that country got a significant result in Samoa with 28%, and in Vanuatu was quite low at 12%. Thank you.
Fascinating.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks for the opportunity to present. Just following up on my colleagues, we'd just like to make a general case, I think, about the utility, I think, of getting attitudinal data in the Pacific. While it's really important to engage with Pacific governments, there's really a missing dimension, we think, in terms of actually engaging with people of the Pacific in terms of what their priorities are. One of the reasons, or the Pacific lacks a sort of robust tradition of gathering popular data, so it's really hard to find out what Pacific people actually think and what their priorities are. Our surveys have allowed us to work closely with institutions in the Pacific, namely Pacific universities, to really get a robust sort of data. We've been really conscious of building the capacity of Pacific researchers in doing that, so that Pacific researchers are better placed to articulate their priorities. We think our data is a really rich source of triangulating, in a sense, what the priorities of Pacific peoples are and how they align with broader aid programming support and engagement. We think our data shows broad alignment of the types of support that Australia is providing to the region with the priorities of Pacific peoples. We would encourage, though, further investments in attitudinal work and working in impactful ways with people across the Pacific to actually help them articulate their priorities in a policy setting.
Chair, thank you very much for this opportunity. In terms of our submission, we'd like to sort of present in terms of the importance of research, teaching, and the collaboration of Australian universities with Pacific universities as well as Pacific national governments and organisations. The PASS research is one of those research projects that sits under the Department of Pacific Affairs, under the program of Pacific Research Program, which we are now in phase 2, which is funded under the DFAT, which Eliora will speak upon, looks after. But this is just a small program of $20 million, and we need much more in terms of our research And what we're trying to articulate and also, I guess, argue for is the importance of this asset that the Australian National University has, which Australia has in this knowledge base of researchers, of experts on the Pacific. Within our small research center, we have about 20 plus researchers and 38 PhD students. But part of that, we are part of the greater Pacific Institute, which is a conglomerate of around 200 scholars of the Pacific who are actually based here in Canberra. And beyond that, we argue for Pacific scholarship, making sure that there's enough funding to ensure that this knowledge base is not lost and that this knowledge base continues to work with. So we have very strong partnerships with the 14 national universities in the Pacific, as well as, if you heard in the past submissions, working with regional organizations. We have very strong counterparts in terms of our projects, as well as our work with national governments. Now, 2 years ago or 3 years ago, when this committee sat, when we made that submission, you did not see Pacific people in these chairs. And now you're seeing them in terms of the knowledge base that's here in Canberra. And what we are arguing for and saying that this needs to continue. This knowledge base of the Pacific, which is here in Canberra, should continue. But also we need more jobs for a lot of our researchers who are coming out of universities. We need those embedded not only in ANU, but across universities in Australia. There should be Pacific centres in Monash. There should be Pacific centres in Sydney and Latrobe, and that's what we're also arguing for, because this is also the knowledge base that supports Pacific diaspora, which are in Australia. And as the aspiration is to grow and integrate the Pacific, you need that knowledge base. Because at the moment, universities from China, universities from Indonesia are also offering that same opportunity to Pacific University. But we need to ensure that we protect that and we grow that. And that's sort of an initial submission on that regards. Thank you.
Chair Professor Tapa, for the opportunity to also contribute to the submission. I want to begin by acknowledging that I am just the only student as part of the Australia Pacific Security College undertaking research in climate change. And I acknowledge the work that we do in ensuring that the submission addresses the concerns of the Pacific, but I feel that a lot of the climate research is done for us by people outside the Pacific and also by elites who don't fully understand what we encounter on the ground. I represent the communities in Kiribati in my research in foregrounding the nuances and perspectives of climate change and asking them what their feelings are, what their future plans are when it comes to the challenges that they face today. And I guess my part in this submission is really to look into the mobility aspects of climate change. There's a lot of growing evidence that climate change is going to impact mobility significantly in the region, and we have seen lessons from the labor mobility schemes that we heard from our first speaker today, and also in the new migration mobility pathways, such as the Falepili Treaty. But I would really urge that the submission includes an inclusive mobility pathway that considers all of the Pacific countries and not just a select few, in particular the most marginalized members of our communities in the Pacific. I would really urge that the consideration of climate change and disaster are included in migration and labor mobility schemes, including the visas. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chair, just to reiterate what Salah Dr. George Carter said, as Senior Project Manager of the Pacific Research Project, I just want to reiterate again the importance of this project and for it to go into a phase 3. In terms of end-of-program outcomes, we look specifically at better informed policy outcomes in the Pacific, better informed Pacific policy makers in the Pacific, obviously in the Pacific, and also stronger Pacific research relationships. We have an existing relationship with the University of the South Pacific. We are building relationships elsewhere with UPNG, the Solomon Islands National University, for example. Just within the work that we've done over the last financial year, we have 260 plus publications, 900 plus students undertaking Pacific-related studies, and we have in terms of Pacific-based readership, we have over 67,000 people reading our work in Fiji.
Doctor, I'm very, very sorry.
No worries.
But we're in a house of democracy,
No worries.
And unfortunately, it can be a pain. So we're going to suspend the meeting. There may be a number of divisions, so we'll try and come back as soon as possible. I do have some questions, but we'll just have to bear with us. So we're going to pause the hearing, and we'll hopefully be back after the divisions. Continue on with anything else you want to say in the opening remarks. Are you happy to? Okay. I'll start off, Ms. Ramon, if it's okay, I'll start with you. One of the themes that we've been hearing a lot about, obviously, is climate change and the obvious threat it poses to Pacific communities. But one of the, and perhaps in your expertise, and as someone from Kiribati, you might be able to offer your perspective on this, is that the threat that climate change poses is not just obviously around water and agriculture and food security and all of the obvious things, but actually in the Pacific, land and connection to land is such an inherent part of people's identity and culture, and it is essential for the way of life in so many Pacific communities. I was wondering if you could talk about or give your view on what it really means in a deeper sense of, goodness me, of the impacts on Pacific people when looking at the insecurity of whether or not you can even stay in your own home. That was my question. Perhaps if you wanted to continue, if you wanted to give your answer, and we can record it, and I will read it in Hansard. But I really appreciate it, and I'm sorry I have to go vote. Yeah, I'll try and come back. Yeah, I've got my stuff here, so I'll try and come back. Right.
Okay, well, thank you for the question. I think it's a really important one to address, and I want to reinforce that coming from one of many low-lying communities in the Pacific, this has been one of the most contentious issues and debates in our region today, considering your future pathway, whether to remain in your country or go somewhere else. I want to speak from the Kiribati perspective, and I've just come back from doing my PhD fieldwork where I spoke to people on the ground in communities in Kiribati, and I was overwhelmed to see the level of awareness that people have on climate change, not just as a subject, but also as a reality, something that they live with and grapple each day. And so we're talking about people who want to decide to make an informed future for their children and children's children, and taking opportunities such as the ones provided by labor mobility and migration opportunities. But there are also others who are very firm on saying we want to remain here because of our spirituality, our connection to our land, and that is something that the government is also promoting. But I guess when we speak about the nuances of climate change in low-lying communities whose life are now hinging on this very decision that Australia and the global community will decide, I guess for me what really struck me is the fact that whether we enter into agreement or cut down on emissions, it would be too late already to change the impact, because already inundation and the climate science has already predicted that low-lying islands like mine will be submerged at a certain point in time in the future. And so that has been a difficult decision for Kiribati, for myself as a mother, but also a researcher in this space, because of that motivation to understand in the lack of protective mechanisms and international law, what do we do to help countries like mine and to help people make their informed decisions, but also help them to build agency and not be rendered vulnerable. We are allergic to the term vulnerable, and the new term in the Pacific now is resilience, and something that I've been trying to convince our people that moving out for work outside or for better futures, greener pastures, yes, may not be green, as we understand. It's such a layered topic when we discuss the labor mobility and the exploitation of our people and the issues that we feel must be addressed, and which is why I want to bring this to the discussion today, because we want to be part of the policy discussions where Australia and the Pacific sit down and manage the movement of our people. Because as our people compete for resources, equitable access to water and food, there is no doubt that this will lead to conflict, but more importantly, it's going to impact on the movement across the Pacific. And certainly an area that we want to be informed and provide plans, but also policies that ensure that our people will safely move across the region and be protected, and their well-being and cultural and national sovereignty are also recognized. So from Kiribati, I think there will be people who have the choice and right. It's a human right to decide whether you want to remain in your country because you have that connection that you want to keep. But also people who want to move for better opportunities, better services, access to dignity and life. And where they feel that if we live in Australia or wherever in the world, my spirituality and connection to the land is not undermined because we believe in always coming back. And I speak on the experience of Kiribati seafarers. The very start of our labour mobility schemes was through our 60-year-long seafaring experience. All of them were given opportunities to stay overseas on the German companies' merchant boats where they worked, but each and every one of them chose to go back home. And I think this really speaks strongly about the spirituality that I refer to here. It's that element of return migration. Migration is not just going and living permanently somewhere. It's always helping families at home, unburden communities from the impacts of climate change, building their economic empowerment, but also helping them to finance in situ adaptation. And so whether you live in Australia or New Zealand or wherever in our blue Pacific continent, we will always return back whatever we can in terms of money, in terms of support. But we also find ourselves going back home to be reconnected with our land. I hope that answers the question, and I'm happy to provide further detail after some discussion.
Can I contribute? Oh, sorry. If I can just contribute as well, recently I've done some work with the Climate Change Development Authority in Papua New Guinea, so moving to another part of the Pacific. Disaster as a result of climate can create a lot of issues, social issues and land tenure issues in PNG. As a result, CCDA was trying to develop as one of their 9 strategic priorities policy based on the need for mobility, not only because of the situation with the Carteret Islands in Bougainville, but also because of disaster. There were a lot of Is that me again? There was a lot of movement happening. Now, at the time, based on this discussion about the need for research-informed policy, CCDA was really struggling with producing research that would be able to inform this one strategic outcome that they had not been able to reach. So I just wanted to reiterate, even in regards to climate, there is definitely a need within Pacific governments to have research-informed policy, especially with regards to their priorities, such as climate and other things. But I just wanted to put that out there. Thank you.
So we had the great opportunity to take our students from here in Canberra, from Australia, to the Pacific, part of it in programs like the New Colombo Plan. So last month we went to Fiji for a period of 2 weeks, and in those classes we are privileged that we are invited to visit communities or villages. And ultimately, you know, when our students are asking the chiefs, the villages, the women's committee, as well as youth in these villages, what is the greatest issue? Of course, you know, there is there is the opportunity to health, good health and education. But ultimately, they're also saying the impacts of climate. So we visited a community where the PTA are the ones who fund the seawall that protects the sea from encroaching upon the kindergarten. You know, and our students were able, are you depending on your government? They said, no, this is something that we have to do ourselves. You know, we have to fundraise every year to put up this brick wall that will come down. But that is because, you know, this is our lived reality. it's something that they have to live with, adapt to year after year. So yes, our data is saying that it may not be seen as an overall general impression that climate change, but the lived reality is that they have to live with this threat. Sea level rise, whether it be ocean acidification impacting on the fisheries that they catch for their daily protein, they are not able to consume that fish. They now have to buy imported offcuts of meats from foreign lands, including Australia and New Zealand. We're selling expensive offcuts to the islands, and so it's changing their dietary, and it's changing and also the diet patterns, and so it leading to an increase on NCDs. This is an impact on their health issues. It impacts the food that they grow, so they're no longer having the sustainable produce or supply of cassava every year. They now have to import more rice. In a place like Tuvalu or Kiribati, the staple food is rice, and all of that is imported. It's changing food patterns for these countries. It's changing their types of protein in terms of the fish, no longer having access to fish. But it also impacts their education. You know, as I've said, if children cannot go to school because of flooding, because of encroaching water onto their school, they don't have these access to these services. So those are in a way that it may not necessarily be the direct impact of climate change, but they exacerbate existing conditions. And communities and people are saying to our students when we visit them in their classes that it's part and parcel, but we are still happy. But that extra funding that comes through in terms of climate finance, or the support of Australia's bilateral, or maybe China's bilateral assistance for infrastructure does help in that adapting to climate change. But ultimately, I'd also like to bring to the attention of the committee the importance of other great work that we're working on in terms of climate change in the science. Australia continues to be the country in terms of its universities and in science researchers connecting with the Pacific to provide that science in terms of meteorology, in terms of the science of climate, and some of the work that now we're embarking on, or working on space technology. Australia is the partner of choice in education. If we are not there, other countries are there to provide. And we're seeing that in other parts of the world. Countries like India, countries like China are now providing satellites to small island nations. Hence the importance of why we need to be in those spaces, that we need to integrate our education systems from the Pacific with Australia. And they also need to see their Pacific scientists in Australian universities, just as how we need to see ourselves in Pacific universities and in Pacific education and in Pacific curriculum. It's a vice versa. That's how we integrate that, because we need to protect the science as well as traditional knowledge from communities is the way that we will able to meet the demands, but also the challenges that climate change will has on our societies. So part of that is also another plug here for the work around diplomacy. As we embark to try and win the COP31 bid between Australia and the Pacific, this is the opportunity that Australia can build with the Pacific its legacy diplomatically. 5 years ago, we were asked in a dinner table with DFAT officials, George, how can we mend the problem that we just had in Tuvalu with Morrison being embarrassed in front of Pacific leaders? How do we build that relationship? I sit in that dinner table that night and I said, we need to have an Australia-Pacific COP. That was 5-6 years ago. Everyone laughed. And look at where we are now. We are at the opportunity of that crust to making sure that we bring that global legacy to Australia with the Pacific. It's an opportunity for the Pacific with Australia to build momentum in bringing about not only green growth, the transition needed for Australia, but also the Pacific. The technology in terms of energy transition the Pacific needs depends on Australia, and that's where the signals needs to come in terms of the science, but also in terms of technology. We have the opportunity to, some of people saying that COP31 doesn't give us any sort of advancement, but it can in terms of bringing a regional response. So I've said it in the last couple of days, this needs to be called the Oceania COP. It brings together the Pacific and Australia, and we have that opportunity through the committee to amplify that. That brings both all those voices in terms of the international bid, in terms of the green bid. But as I've said, those are just ways that we can connect from the local community in the Pacific all the way here to the work that we do in Canberra.
Thank you. For the last couple of minutes, does anyone have any concluding remarks they'd like to put on the record?
Perhaps just following on from my colleagues, and I don't want to speak to this myself, but rather to iterate the views of Ni Vanuatu respondents to this question. If I refer the committee to figure 18 of our submission, what sort of support, bearing in mind this is a nationally representative sample of 1,300 Ni Vanuatu, what sort of support to help communities adapt to climate change would you like to see? The largest response, about 36%, was help with infrastructure. The second largest response at 31% was help with relocation, and then followed by help with livelihoods and jobs at 14%, and finally direct compensation at 14%. So very much indicating the priorities of Ni Vanuatu respondents there around this particular question.
Just a comment on, a few weeks ago I presented to the Pacific Islands Forum calling attention to the need to address the mobility situation in the Pacific, and the concern was really around brain drain and climate impacts, forcing our people to live in droves. So my message is that this is a space for Australia and the Pacific to work very closely. And I understand that the leaders are preparing for 2025 a decision in terms of managing the movement of our people, and certainly an area that we would like to include in the submission for Australia to also consider.
All right, thank you. On behalf of the chair, I'm just going to read the final piece of his statement. Thank you for your time today. If you have been asked to provide any additional information, including questions on notice, please forward it to the Secretariat by Thursday, the 26th of September 2024. Please note that responses to questions on notice will be published on the website as submissions to the inquiry. You'll be sent a copy of the transcript for your evidence to assist you with answering questions taken on notice today, and you will have an opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. I'd like to thank the committee members and witnesses for their time today and declare the public hearing closed.